So for those of you who don't know me and don't follow me on TikTok, I am the Rare Buckaroo on TikTok. My name is Sarah Jean Waddell. And my TikTok platform revolves around a lot of horsemanship, horse training, horse education, striving to become a better horseman, and also Mustang advocacy. A lot of people, I defend these Mustangs tooth and nail. And the reason why that I do that is because I used to be formerly anti-gather, and now my mind has completely changed after working or after moving to Eastern Oregon. My mind, when I started seeing these horses year round and seeing the conditions that these horses are in and the actual truth, and finding out that everything that I believed was a lie, it has become one of my missions to show the truth and tell people the truth and advocate, because I have gone from formerly anti-gather to working for the BLM Wild Horse Corrals now. Pretty drastic change for quite a few people, and I've been encouraged by quite a few friends to write a book on my experience from being formerly anti-gather to now working at the BLM Wild Horse Corrals and advocating for gathering these Mustangs and managing them. And generally when I get into debates with people about this, I tell them there is not an argument that you can argue with me that I have not argued myself. And when I moved out here locally to these HMAs in Oregon, and Oregon does a better job, I would say one of the best jobs, keeping these Mustangs as close to AML as possible than other states, and I still see the effects and the conditions that these horses are in, and it breaks my heart. And so it has been a goal of mine to educate people and teach them the truth. So I usually tell people when we get into debates about this and people are telling me that I'm wrong, I'm like, I'm telling you right now, I used to argue the exact same thing until I moved locally to these horses and work firsthand with ranchers and the BLM. And I can tell you that everything that these anti-gather groups are telling you is a complete lie, and honestly it is propaganda. And so one of the things that I want to cover today in this video is a common argument that a lot of people make, and that argument is if we remove livestock from public lands from ranchers, that will prevent Mustangs from needing to be gathered. This argument right here is completely illogical if you really actually start thinking in depth on it. This argument, if you go beyond just removing livestock off of public land, that plan right there just starts breaking down one step past thinking just removing, if you think of the long-term consequences. There's a lot of things that people don't know about ranchers, and when it comes to livestock, a lot of people call them welfare ranchers, that they're using the land for free. Ranchers don't use public land for free. They have to pay for their permits to use allotments on public lands. They have to pay a pretty good amount of money. They have to pay per head, and they're only allowed a certain amount of head depending on the allotment. And each allotment is divided into pastures. And cattle and livestock are only on those allotments for a short amount of time during the year, generally starting end of June and have to be off by the beginning of October. There's a lot of stuff that people don't understand of all the rules and regulations when it comes to having livestock on public land. It's not just they just turn them out there and gather them when they want to take, their calving or lambing crop and take it to the sale. There is a lot of rules and regulations and everything that they have to abide by. They're not doing it for free. They're not out there just turning livestock out and gathering up when they need them, and they're not out there year round. They're also not in the same spot year round. All this livestock that is out on public ground is, these allotments are divided into pastures. The livestock are only allowed in a certain pasture for a certain amount of time. The BLM and the Forest Service manage and let the ranchers know that you have to move and be off of this pasture and into this pasture by this date. And so that's why they're moving cattle all the time, or moving their livestock from pasture to pasture. And the BLM and the Forest Service monitor the grass growth around in high grazing areas. So they go out there and they will measure the grass. And so if a cattle rancher or rancher is in a certain pasture and they're counting on leaving their cows in there for 3 weeks, and a week and a half in, the Forest Service goes up there and measures the grass in that high grazing area, they have to move their cattle. If that grass does not meet requirements, they say you got to move your cattle down to the next pasture. So that means that the rancher has to gather up all their cattle, move it to the next pasture, which is a week and a half shorter time that they had planned on them being there, which in turn means they're a week and a half earlier on the next pasture, which means that they'll probably have to move their cattle again a week and a half or more earlier, depending on how the grazing is happening and how high traffic grazing areas are impacted by these cattle, or how water areas, stuff like that, streams, how the banks and everything like that. This is all monitored by the BLM and by the Forest Service. That's what a range con and them do for the Forest Service and the BLM. They monitor the usage that these cattle ranchers are using on these allotments. And so they're only allowed up there for a certain amount of time in each pasture and a certain amount of time total. They're not up there year round. They're not up there all the time. They're not out in these allotments 100% of the time. In the wintertime, in the fall, ranchers have to bring their livestock home and feed them, or turn them out on some pastures and then start feeding them in the winter. There's a lot of things that these anti-gather people do not know, and what anti-gather advocates do not research. Either they refuse to research and get into depth about it, or they just don't post it because it doesn't back up exactly what they're saying. And so beyond that, let's get into some detail about, I'm going to have to read a little bit off of my Facebook post here so I can keep on topic. So let's get into a little bit of more detail about the rancher side in public lands. Ranchers depend on public lands to stay in operation. 98% of ranches in the U.S. are family owned and operated. So one of the things that anti-gather advocates and pages and stuff like that and sanctuaries talk about is that big corporate ranches are ruining range for these Mustangs. And they make it sound like it's all these big corporate ranches that have millions of acres of public land that they run their cattle on, like a majority of where all the Mustangs are. That's just not the truth. 98% of ranches are family owned and operated. So if you were to kick off all of ranchers, all of their livestock off of public land, you're affecting 98% of ranches that are family owned and operated, that are probably generation upon generation upon generation of raising livestock and making a living off of that. So the myth of big corporate ranches running the country is a lie, and told by anti-gather supporters to not feel guilty about putting families out of business and ruining generations of ranchers. The average ranch ranges around 442 acres of land. That's not that much land for a rancher. The average ranch, 442 acres, is not that large. It's fairly, when it comes to a ranch, that's a fairly small plot of land. One cow on average needs 1 acre of land, not including if the cow has a calf, or if you're more in a dry area. Here in Eastern Oregon, you need a significant higher amount of acreage per cow, because the forage here is not the same as it would be in southern states, or even on the California coast, or even on the Oregon coast. 1 acre for 1 cow is going to be way more than what they need on the coast. But here, it's more like 30 to 50 acres per cow. So when you add that up, you're going to need a lot of acreage to house enough cattle, to be able to keep enough cattle to actually make a living off of. And that's where the public lands and allotments and permits to use those allotments come in. Let's see here. Depending on the geographical area that you are in, the amount of cattle you may need to feed a family can range anywhere from 3 to 600 head of cows. So depending on the geographical area, if your cows are getting really high, nutritious green grass and feed, they're going to fatten up a lot easier. You're not going to need as many cows because they're going to weigh more when they go to slaughter. So depending on where you're at and what type of feed, depending on what type of cattle you're running, it ranges anywhere from 3 to 600 head of cows. You also need to keep in mind that a ranch needs space for equipment, hay storage, other animals, housing, crops. So if you're a ranch that not only is just solely a livestock ranch, but you're also running a hay operation, which most ranches do run some sort of hay operation so that they can feed their livestock through the winter, 442 acres on average is not enough land to sustain enough cattle to support your family. And you also, keep in mind, like I said, housing for equipment, places to park equipment, storage sheds, stuff like that. 442 acres gets really small really fast when you really talk about even just space for all of that, what it takes to take care of cattle or livestock. It gets small really fast, and now you have not that much room to feed cattle or livestock year round. So the average size ranch isn't big enough to actually have enough cattle to support a family for a living. And then for those, I've gotten this argument before where people say beef cattle that go to slaughter, the beef that you buy from the store, doesn't come from ranches, it comes from feedlots. Yes and no. They do eventually go to a feedlot, but the calf, when it is born and raised until weaning age, it is on a ranch. It's not born and raised at a feedlot for a majority of the amount of time. There are feedlot areas that do have some cow-calf pairs and they breed their own, but feedlots are specifically designed for weaned calves to go to the feedlot to be finished before they head to slaughter. So let's talk about public lands real quick. There is 155 million acres of public lands that are allotments for ranchers. Now, that's not all the public lands. That is just 155 million is allotments that are allowed for livestock grazing usage. And they're not free, as I stated before. You have to pay for permits to use them, and you're limited to the amount of time that your livestock is allowed on each allotment and allowed in each pasture, as I covered earlier, as well as maintain the fence on their own money. The ranchers are responsible for paying for all the fencing equipment and supplies, the time, the money to hire somebody to do it if they can't do it themselves. And I know this because I've done it. I've done fencing for ranchers, and I have done hundreds and hundreds of acres of fencing. One of the previous ranches that I worked at, I worked from beginning of April to August solely fencing grazing allotments. And it was awful. I've done my time fencing. And the rancher is responsible for all the equipment and all of the tools, all the fencing supplies, the fence, the wire, the stays, the T-posts. They're financially responsible for replacing and fixing the fence. Let's see here, where was I? Let's see here. These public lands are ran by the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. Also, it costs the average taxpayer, or it costs us taxpayers, $15 to $22 per acre. Per acre of ungrazed lands. There's 640 million acres of public land, and only 155 million are used for grazing allotments for livestock. Now, it only costs a taxpayer $3 per acre to manage grazed public lands. So those livestock allotments that the rangers use only cost the taxpayer $3 per acre. There's, as I said, 640 million acres of public land in the U.S. 155 million are utilized by ranchers. That means 485 million acres of non-grazed public lands is costing the average taxpayers $7 billion using the minimum of $15 per acre. That's how much it is costing for those 485 million acres minimum, using the minimum of $15 per acre. Let's see here. All of 640 million acres, if they were all grazed and managed and cost the taxpayer that $3 per acre, would cost less. If all public lands were grazed and the cost the taxpayer at $3 per acre, all 640 million acres would cost less than what it is costing the taxpayer right now than to manage the 485 million. It would cost just over $1 million for all 640 million acres if all public lands were grazed and utilized by ranchers at $3 an acre. So let's see here. Mustangs run on 26.9 million acres. Out of the 640 million acres of public land, Mustangs run on 26.9 million of public lands. Now, before someone gets worked up how Mustangs have less land, keep in mind that in reality, Mustangs and livestock really don't actually run in common that much on public lands. Also, you need to know, and I recommend for anybody who doesn't believe this, look up, I actually posted this on my Facebook, where it shows a picture where I overlaid 2 pictures of western states, the western United States, and it shows a map of public grazing allotments that are utilized for ranchers, and then a map of all the HMAs in western states. And you can see that they actually don't run that much in common. That takes 5 seconds on Google to look up the 2 maps. You need to know, for instance, that feral Mustangs, and in the instance that Mustangs and livestock do run in common, if that allotment that rancher is paying for has met or exceeded AML/AUM. AML is appropriate management level. That is what we say for Mustangs. If we say a HMA herd management area, their AML is 300. That is 300 horses that land can healthily sustain. Animal unit month is AUM, and that's what we refer to with cattle as well. So that is like an appropriate management level for livestock, not just cattle, but to be on that allotment. So if that is met or exceeded by Mustangs, then the rancher will not be able to use that allotment for their livestock, but still have to pay for their permit/AUM in order to keep it. So essentially they're paying to feed feral Mustangs instead of their own livestock that pays their bills. You can't graze land that doesn't have grass to graze. And also you need to keep in mind too that if these Mustangs, it's not just like if they've met/exceeded AML/AUM. It is if the range cons go out there, and because they monitor the grass and everything like that where there is Mustangs and there is livestock, they go out and monitor that grass and they check the conditions before ranchers are even allowed to turn their cattle out in June and predict on what kind of growth we're going to have for that season when it comes to turning cattle out. Now, if it's a dry season and the Mustangs are close to AML, the rancher's numbers are going to get cut. So, say a rancher may be able to have 300 cattle on that allotment. Well, it's not going to be a good grow year. It's going to be a dry year. So now you're only allowed 150. So you still have to pay that, but you're not going to be able to turn out half of the amount of cattle that you're expected to turn out onto that allotment. These lands are managed by the BLM. They're monitored. It's not just, all right, go and turn your cows out, have fun. Let us know how it's going. It's monitored pretty well by the BLM and by the Forest Service to make sure that the livestock and the Mustangs are actually going to have enough feed to go out and rate, and that the land, because it's Bureau of Land Management, as Ryan Chastain said on his podcast that I steal all the time, the BLM priority was created to manage public lands. Bureau of Land Management. And Mustangs were dumped on their plate. And so now they are in charge of managing the Mustangs. And Forest Service, kind of the same deal with Forest Service Mustangs. They were in charge of land management, and horses were dumped on their plate because they didn't know what else to do. And so the BLM has to go out and make sure that the land is going to actually be able to sustain that amount of animals in that area. And if that land can't healthily sustain a certain amount of animals, the ranchers' numbers get cut, not the Mustangs. And the ranchers still have to pay for it. And then also a lot of people will claim ranchers still turn cattle out and stuff like that, or all of this. Just keep in mind, these livestock that these ranchers are turning out and utilizing the public lands that they're paying for, they don't want them to die. So if there's no water and there's no feed, you're not going to turn the animals that pay your bills and feed your family out to die. A rancher's main priority is not only to keep the land that they have, that they use on public lands, but also to make it to where that land not only grows back next year, but grows back better the year even after. Ranchers are stewards of not only livestock, but stewards of the land as well. It is not in a rancher's best intention to overgraze an area to the point where next year when they turn their cows out, there's half the amount of feed the next year because they overgrazed it. So now that we talked about kind of like the public lands and the ranchers in that aspect, let's talk about why removing livestock from public lands is not a feasible option beyond that. The U.S. is the third largest beef export. 2005 through 2018, the U.S. was actually number one. And that's a significant amount of time for a country to remain in the number one spot for beef export. Bringing in $9.3 billion to the country. 1.4 million metric tons, that's over 3 billion pounds of beef, is exported from the U.S. every year. To give you an idea how much cattle that really is, the average carcass weight for processing is approximately 800 pounds, give or take. That's 375,000 cows exported. Carcass weight. So the number's actually probably more. Exported from the U.S. Not including beef, or that is not, let's see here, not including beef that is not exported, that remains in the U.S. So if 375,000 cattle is being exported from the U.S., making the U.S. number 2 in the world, or number 3 in the world, for beef export. Imagine how much cattle is actually staying in the U.S. to feed people here. This is also not including goat, pig, sheep, and chicken and turkey meat either for export. This is solely beef export. Beef export is the second. Overall meat export, I couldn't find an actual number on that. It was, couldn't really find exactly any clear, statistics on that. There's a lot of opinions and stuff like that on that, but nothing that was actually proven. Removing livestock from public lands not only would be detrimental to the U.S. economy, causing massive inflation, which would put a lot of people homeless, which is ironic because so many anti-gather advocates, as stated, are claiming that it's all large, massive corporate ranches with hundreds of thousands of head of cattle that are using the public lands with million-acre ranches that are using it, when it's actually only 98%, when it's only 2% of ranches in the U.S. that are actually big corporate-run ranches. So advocates are not saying that because they don't want people to feel bad for putting ranchers in a homeless situation. But it would also cause massive price increases on the items that you use every day. And this is something that I point out to diehard vegans who claim ranchers are abusing their livestock and to stop eating meat. Every day you're using a byproduct of an animal. No matter what. No matter how hard you try, you are using animal byproduct whether you know it or not. A lot of people don't know exactly what animal byproduct is for. Like, a lot of people, when they find out that cow hooves are in gelatin to make your jello, they like lose their minds and they're like, oh my god. I'm like, well, the cell phone that you literally saw that fact on, or the computer that it popped up on your Facebook feed, has the exact same thing. It has animal fat, blood, hooves, all in it to make what your computer or your phone. Smartphones, computer you're reading this on, fat, blood, skin, and bones. Tennis racket strings are made from internal organs of livestock. If you've ever had surgery where you've needed stitches, or taken your animal to the vet where they've needed stitches, internal organs of livestock. Shaving cream, shampoo, aging cream, laundry detergent, soap, animal byproduct of livestock is in there. Fats, stuff like that. Drive a car, ride a bus, animal byproduct in the tires to make rubber. So every single day, no matter how die-hard vegan you are or anti-meat, don't eat meat, unless you were to go out and live like a nomad life where you solely make everything yourself out of plants and trees and natural vegetation, you are not actually vegan. You're not animal product free. Everything that you use, not everything, I should say, a majority of the things that you use on an everyday basis have an animal byproduct in it. And with the U.S. being number one beef export, which a lot of the byproduct that we use in everyday items has a lot of byproduct from beef. The skin, the hooves, the bones, the blood, all of that animal byproduct in it. You can't prevent not using it unless you were to go and live in the middle of the woods without a cell phone, no internet connection, and you literally went and found stuff to sew your own clothes and make your own house out of solely just vegetation. That is the only way that you could actually be truly vegan or animal cruelty, whatever, free. That's the only way that you could do it. The fact of the matter is, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. Removing ranchers and livestock from public lands is not the solution. And having that mindset shows that you have not done your research and thought beyond the remove livestock from public lands. Because think about it. If you remove livestock from public lands, you would be putting 98% of farmers and ranchers out of business, which make up for a huge amount of the U.S. economy. And let's see here, I looked up on my phone today, actually, one of the things. U.S. agriculture, which is cattle ranching and farming, or ranching and livestock ranching and farming, makes up for roughly $1.264 trillion to the of gross income for the U.S. economy. Imagine putting those people out of business. So if you were to put those people out of business, it means you're getting rid of that animal byproduct that you use for everyday life, that gets you to and from work, that cleaned your hair, that you're watching this YouTube video on right now, that provides the equipment, the supplies to build the router so you can have internet access. The computer you're watching it on, just as I said, animal byproduct is in it. The clothes that you wear, you got shoes on your feet, rubber soles, has animal byproduct. Plastics, animal byproduct. All of it. It would not only be completely detrimental to the United States economy by shutting down 98% of farmers and ranchers, it would ruin the U.S. economy by taking out a massive intake of trade and export for the U.S., but it would affect your day-to-day lives by increasing inflation with the cell phones that you buy, the shoes that you buy. Imagine paying, if you had to pay just for a cheap pair of shoes, $800, because we have to come up with some other way, because the animal byproduct is the cheapest way to make products. And if we have to figure out that we have to buy it from another country instead of get it from our own, it's going to be rough. American made items would be completely obsolete and would be gone, because we cannot get the product that we need to make them. So removing cattle ranchers off of public lands is not a feasible action. And a lot of people don't think about that. Because even if you think about it like, okay, yeah, let's remove ranchers off of public lands. And yeah, that might fix it for a couple of years. But then when the economy starts to detrimentally crash because of it, and everyday items start becoming outstandingly expensive because we don't have the byproduct to make them, and we have to buy it from other countries, where does that put the economy? But also, it's not going to stop. Even if it did not ruin the U.S. economy, if somehow we figured out something that we could remove all livestock off of public lands, say that we could do that and it would not affect the economy. Say that there was a plan in action that we could do something like that without ruining our lives as we know it. It would not solve the problem, regardless, because horses are going to breed whether a cow's standing there and watching them or not. It's not going to stop the Mustangs from overpopulating, which is the issue right now. That is the issue, is overpopulation of these Mustangs. It has nothing to do with cattle ranchers, because like I said, if that HMA, if they are running in common, is already close to AML or exceeded AML, ranchers not going to be able to put cattle out there anyways, but they still have to pay for it. But the rancher's not going to be able to put their cows out there. The problem with these Mustangs is overpopulation. They're going to breed no matter what. Removing livestock off of public lands is not going to solve Mustangs from breeding. They're going to keep doing it. And that is the issue. And I actually created a Facebook post around when we were doing the Steens Gather here. There was a lot of people saying that, oh, it's because of the drought. That's the only reason why these Mustangs are skinny. It has nothing to do with the fact that the Steens HMA is overpopulated. They're perfectly fine. It has everything. I was up there in June when the grass was green and they looked fine, but because it's a drought, that's why they're skinny right now. No, it has nothing to do with drought, because my horses are literally across the road. Literally right across the road from the Steens HMA. And my horses were fat and shiny and slicked off and happy, and they were out on the exact same pasture. The only difference between my horses that I own and the Steens HMA horses was the fact that they had a water trough filled with water all the time. But they ate the same feed. They didn't have any salt or mineral blocks, nothing. Everything was exactly the same, and my horses were overweight. Why? Because even in the small pasture that my horses were in, there was enough feed to supply them. They were fine. The problem with the Steens HMA, the reason why that those horses were so extremely skinny, and you should have seen some of those horses when they came in, and how poor of a body condition a lot of those horses were. It sickened me. It sickened me that these horses are so... People advocate for these horses to be left on range in that condition. But the difference is that there was too many horses. I guarantee you, if we were to put 10 more horses in the same pasture that my horses were in, and we didn't give them any extra feed, they'd be in the same condition. Why? Because that pasture didn't have enough feed to support that many horses. It wasn't drought, it was overpopulation. And that is the issue with these Mustangs, and that is the issue on why they need to be gathered and they need to be managed. It has nothing to do with livestock being out on public lands. Nothing at all. If somehow we could figure out that removing livestock off of public lands and not putting 98% of ranchers, family owned and operated ranchers, with the average size of ranch being 442 acres, completely out of business and not ruining the U.S. economy, and leaving those Mustangs on range and not managing them, it wouldn't solve the problem. Not even for a year. All it did is just ruin the U.S. economy, and now these Mustangs, we don't have any money to manage them now because the economy is just So now you got even more Mustangs dying of starvation and dehydration on range. So thank you guys for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe, I guess it is, here on YouTube. I'll be covering a variety of different topics, from horse training, horsemanship, all of that stuff, down to stuff like this, why Mustangs need to be gathered. Basically, everything that pertains to horses and horsemanship. So thank you guys for joining today, and see you next time, I guess.